Our next guest, Mr. Robert Murphy.
This presentation has been brought to you by Gigi Bowman for State Senate and Oath Keepers.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. Again, we keep saying this, but we really do appreciate you guys coming out here because this really is a matter where it's going to take a small group of people to know the truth and then to communicate that outward. And so it is crucial that people like you show up and the people watching this on YouTube and so forth. Now, what I'm supposed to talk about right now is on what's called Austrian economics, and I am going to get to that, but I'm concerned because I know the debate last night got a little heated, and actually we ended up talking about things that were not strictly related to the debate. So I'm afraid some of you are going to be a little bit reserved, and you're going to, not be comfortable because what I'm talking about in this talk really doesn't relate directly to that disagreement that Bill Still and I had last night, and so. I want to just give you an analogy just to show you where I was coming from, not to try to change anyone's mind, but just to get you to see the way people could disagree about that. So imagine you are having an argument with somebody over education and schooling, and that person said, I want all curriculum decisions to be centered in Washington to communicate out to everyone, to make sure that people learn how to read and write and so forth, to make sure that we have an educated group of citizens growing up. And then you might say, well, no, I kind of want freedom for individual parents. And if somebody wants to send it to a private school that uses a different curriculum, I think people should have that right. And even if people want to just homeschool their kid, I think people should have that right as well. So that would be a legitimate disagreement. But if the other person then said, oh, so you're against literacy, there would just be anarchy in your system, and therefore, how do we know? I mean, for all we know, people could just walk around teaching everyone 2 + 2 = 6. And you'd see the irony of that the person in favor of decentralization and freedom and individual choice would say, no, on the contrary, I think that my system, my approach would lead to more literacy and so forth. And actually, ironically, it's your system that leads to absurdities like people not correcting someone if they get taught 2 + 2 = 6. Okay, so again, I'm not trying to get you, if last night, I know there were some coming up to me and said, oh, you did a great job. Others of you came up to me at the bar and explained to me what a terrible job I did, right? So it was fine. So again, I'm not going to change your mind in this 2 minutes up here in this preamble. I'm just trying to get you to see, in particular, what Bill Still was trying to make it look like was that he was for rule of law and I was for the rule of the jungle. And I'm saying, no, we were just disagreeing about what's the best way to get the rule of law. We can all agree right now we do not have the rule of law in this country with the current system. And so it's just that we were disagreeing about what's the best way to reform it. If I still haven't won you over, I encourage you to come to the karaoke tonight. When you see me do my Roy Orbison, you're going to see I'm just a cuddly teddy bear, okay? That's the last thing I'll say on that. Okay, hopefully I've gotten you to relax a little bit. Let me tell you, give you a crash course on what's called Austrian economics. So first of all, that term, what is it? Are we talking about the GDP of Vienna? No, what it is, it's an unfortunate term because it doesn't contain very much information. But what we mean by a school of economics is just a way of approaching discussions of the economy. How do you analyze the economy? So many of you have probably heard of the Keynesian school, and that's actually the dominant paradigm right now. Whether people use that term or not, that's the idea that when there's a recession, it's because people aren't spending enough. And so you see this infiltrate just the standard media coverage. You'll hear things like, consumers were more confident, this quarter, economists reported, and so therefore they projected that GDP growth would be such and such, or we're going into the holiday season and consumers are still a bit skittish, and so economists are concerned. And it leads you to believe that if only we had Christmas every month, the economy would be fine, right? If only people would just go to the mall and blow their paycheck week after week or every 2 weeks, that the economy would be fine. And it's just, gosh darn it, people are silly and they're saving too much. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, that's really the critique of what Keynesians are saying right now, is that people are saving too much, and that's the fundamental problem. All right, there's also what's called the Chicago School of Economics, associated with Milton Friedman's the most famous one, so many of you have probably heard of that school. And they're very free market, whereas the Keynesians tend to be more relying on government interventions. But there's also what's called the Austrian school. And so on many issues, they happen to coincide with the Chicago school, but one area where they're actually quite different is partly what I'm going to be talking about in this talk, is when it comes to money and banking and interest rates. Okay, so last thing, where does that term come from? Why is it called the Austrian school? That's just the historical legacy. The founders of this particular way of thinking happened to be from Austria in the 1870s, and so the German-speaking economists sort of were trying to disparage them and say, oh, that's just Austrian economics, because Germany was like the cultural center of civilization, in terms of respectable economic thought back then. So that's where the term came from, and then it just stuck. This, as far as some icons in it, I know a lot of people here are familiar with Ron Paul, so the type of economics that he endorses, that is Austrian economics. Friedrich Hayek, who wrote The Road to Serfdom, he won the Nobel Prize in '74. He was a prime representative of this school. So one of the things that Hayek won the Nobel Prize for was his work on business cycle theory, and that's what I want to spend the rest of my time in this talk telling you guys about, because there's all sorts of areas where the Austrians differ from other schools, and I, of course, adhere to this school of thought. I went to grad school, went to NYU precisely because one of the giants, his name was Ludwig von Mises, in this tradition, taught at NYU for many years. So that's why I'm here representing them. And there's various reasons for why I think that they have the right approach compared to these other possible schools, but the one in particular that's relevant for everyone now is their diagnosis of the business cycle. Because as we're going to see, what the government and the Federal Reserve have been doing in response to the crisis of 2008, according to the Austrians, is the exact wrong thing. Not only does it not help, but it actually is sowing the seeds for the next crisis. And this is I really love Gigi's event here. And by the way, we all keep thanking her for this. And I've put on events like this in Nashville. That's where I live. And if you've never done it, you really have no idea just what a pain this thing is. It's like, imagine throwing a wedding for a bunch of people you don't know, right? It's like that. So actually, though, compared to your relatives, maybe you'd prefer to do that. But in any event, what's interesting about this event is that it's not just one specific issue with various people all speaking on the same issue. Obviously, it's multidimensional. And why I'm, besides just all the things I'm learning from the various experts here, what's interesting is I'm seeing analogies in how, let me just take two examples. So in terms of security from terrorists, we realize that, wait a minute, the NSA is spying on all of us, and the various things that the U.S. military is doing abroad, not only is that not protecting us, but that's a large contributor to the very problem that they're saying they're protecting us from, right? Or when it comes to pharmaceuticals and antidepressant drugs, it's not merely that they're ineffective and that it's not curing, it's that it's driving people to suicide, okay? So that paradigm that you see, and then of course with all these things, they have plenty of people with PhDs who will line up and explain why the current approach is the right one, and why somebody who disagrees is just some kook nut job and don't listen to that fringe person. This is what the respectable people at Harvard will tell you, okay? And so it's the same thing in economics. The people from Harvard and the other Ivy League schools will get up there. They're the ones who go to the Federal Reserve. They're the ones who work in the government, the Council of Economic Advisors, and they will explain to you why what the government has been doing and the Fed has been doing since the crisis in 2008 is the right thing, and don't listen to these Austrians. They're not at MIT like we are. And so I'm just saying, I hope you're at least receptive to this message, because notice it's the same pattern in all these other areas where we can clearly see that what the government and the big players are doing is causing the very problem, or at least greatly exacerbating the problem they're allegedly solving. Okay, so very briefly, what is it that the Austrians say caused the business cycle? So we have this thing, we just know, looking at history, there's these booms where business picks up, it seems like there's prosperity, everyone has a job, and apologies to Josh Hawley, maybe that's a bad thing, but okay, everything's great, unemployment rate drops, people are spending money, they're buying mink coats for their wives and so forth, buying necklaces for their mistresses, and then there's a crash, and then just it seems like, man, business is bad. So in any given year, there are some businesses that fail, right? People make mistakes, but it seems like there's this clustering of mistakes that for some reason, every once in a while, periodically, it's like a bunch of business people say, oh my gosh, what the heck were we thinking? And they have to lay off a bunch of people, or they just go out of business altogether. And so it seems like there's this pattern. And so the Austrians have a specific explanation for what that is, and they're saying what causes a crash, it's not that something happens all of a sudden, like, oh, people just aren't spending enough, and so that's why the government has to come in and boost spending until the economy gets back on its feet. The Austrians say what causes the crashes is the preceding boom. that's the unnatural thing, and that the boom is artificial. It boosts the economy to an unsustainable level, and then there's a crash. So I think, let me just take a few moments to let you really see how this works, and especially since this is a crowd of if I'm talking to like 18-year-olds, a lot of times this is a little bit difficult because they haven't been in their own business or they haven't bought a house or anything like that. But with you guys, you should at least be able to follow this, and I'm going to go down this path just because I really want you to get it and see the issue. So the Austrians, like other economists, think that market prices communicate information, that market prices do something. It really means something if a barrel of oil is $95 as opposed to 120 or as opposed to 30. It's not just some arbitrary number, that communicates real information, and it causes people to either buy less gas or they buy a more fuel-efficient car, or if the price of oil is really high, that causes entrepreneurs to look more heavily into developing electric cars and things like that, right? And that's what you want, that the price tells people what to do. It signals how scarce things are. Just to give you a simple example, people deciding what lines of work to go into, part of the benefit of the market economy is there's various wage rates. You can see what salary you can earn in the various lines, and that helps people choose. So that's how we can have a free society, or we'd like to have a free society, right, where people can choose their occupations. If you went hundreds of years ago when there was a guild system and said to somebody in that time period, imagine living in a world where anyone can just go into any line of business they want. If you want to be a carpenter, you can do that. If you want to be a metalsmith, you can do that. If you want to be a librarian, you can do that. And there's no group of people in charge of assigning who does what. And the person might say, what are you, crazy? What if no one decides to be a farmer? Then we'll all starve to death. Or what if no one wants to go into carpentry? Then there won't be any wood products. And you could say, well, no, because what happens is there'd be prices, and you would see if not enough people were going into farming, then there wouldn't be much food, and the price of an apple would be really high, so more people would get into that line. Or if there weren't enough carpenters, the returns of that would go up, and so new people would go into those lines. So that's how it can be that we have free choice of what you do, and yet there's some feedback. You get a sense of what is it that other people out there want me to do for them. They're not forcing you to. They don't stick a gun to your head, but the amount of money you can earn to various things is like a signal that everybody else is giving you through the market pricing process as to this is where your efforts are desired the most. You don't have to do the thing that earns you the most money. Like maybe you could make the most dollars by working at a hedge fund, but that would just drive you crazy and you'd feel like you sold your soul. You don't have to do that. It's just showing you some people are willing to pay you this. You could do something else. But the point is those prices give you information, help you control what you're doing, help you make an informed choice about how best to serve others in the voluntary market. Okay, so that's the general rule. What is it that the interest rate does? So that's a particular price. And again, if the interest rate is 8%, that means one thing. If it's 2%, that means something else. And so in the Austrian view, the interest rate helps regulate the length of investments that businesses make. So let me just give you a real quick example. If you're going to have an apartment building, let's say you're thinking you're an entrepreneur and you're looking at this project. Someone brings it to you, shows you the numbers. They say you can spend $1 million developing this plot of land, building a small apartment building, and then our projections are with this amount of rent you could charge in this neighborhood, you would earn $100,000 net income year after year. Net of property taxes and things like that. You'd earn $100,000 on this investment year after year if you maintained it. So should you make that investment? And you don't have enough information because what you know is you'd put up $1 million and you would earn $100,000 a year, so you're earning 10% on your money. In order to say, is this a good idea or not, you need to know, well, what's the market rate of interest? If I could invest in T-bills and earn 15%, well, then it would be silly for me to only earn 10 in this far riskier thing of having an apartment building. Okay, but if interest rates elsewhere are only 2%, well, then now being able to earn 10% in this apartment complex project, that's more attractive. Okay, so you see how, just in that simple example, if the interest rate's really high, you would be less likely to invest and build this apartment complex and go ahead with this long-term project. Whereas the lower the interest rate is, the more likely you'd be to do it. So that's what the Austrians say happened. There was the dot-com bubble. So here I'm trying to relate now to you guys like this general theory as to specifically how did we get in this current mess, and then you'll see if that diagnosis is right, why what they've been doing since 2008 is the wrong thing. Okay, so the Austrian explanation, how do we get to this mess, is that back in the 99-2000, there was the dot-com bubble and crash. And then the Fed chief at the time was Alan Greenspan, and he slashed interest rates. And that's the correct thing to do according to the Keynesian playbook. Interest rates, what's called the federal funds rate, is the one the Fed targets. And it was like 6.5%. He brought it down to 1% by June of 2003 and held it there for a year. And then they started ratcheting it up again because price inflation started kicking in, and so the Fed started getting nervous. Oh, we better start raising rates and take our foot off the gas. And so that's the paradigm that they use. It's a very crude approach where they just say lowering interest rates is a good thing. It stimulates the economy. It causes more spending. And the only downside is, if we do too much of it, then prices start rising too much. But so long as prices aren't going through the roof, that's fine. We're helping, because it's a very crude approach. Whereas the Austrians, and this isn't just ex post looking back, they were saying this in real time. Ron Paul was warning of this in 2002. Plenty of people were doing it much later. We're saying having the interest rate that low is a false signal. That's telling entrepreneurs that there's more savings than there really is. Because the way Greenspan lowers the interest rate, it's not that he draws upon the savings he's built up over a lifetime of frugality. No, they just create money out of thin air and go buy government bonds, and that's how they push down the interest rate. And so that's fake, that's artificial. So lowering interest rate from 6.5 down to 1, which is what they did back in the early 2000s, that wasn't showing that, look, there's more savings available. That was just funny money they created through computer entries. But yet that did alter everyone's behavior. By their own admission, people were calling Greenspan the maestro. Some of you might remember that. And why? Because even amidst that dot-com crash, home prices kept rising. So back then, that was considered a good thing. And it was only later, 2006 and 2007, that people started saying, wait a minute, maybe giving us a housing bubble to replace the dot-com bubble was a mixed blessing at best. And then by 2008, when the crisis really hit, people were realizing it would have been better had Greenspan just let us go through the dot-com crash in the early 2000s. That all he really did was postpone the problem, let us continue for several more years to think we were richer than we really were. And so now that the chickens come home to roost and the crisis resumes, we realize, wait a minute, things really are bad. Okay, so if you buy that general story, at least understand the logic behind that and how it didn't really make Americans richer, that with the agony of what would have been dealing with the dot-com bust, we didn't get spared that by just having really low interest rates that gave us a housing bubble. That just actually postponed the inevitable, the day of reckoning, continued the illusion. Well, that's exactly what they did in 2008. So at that point, it was no longer just, a bunch of dot-com stocks were crashing. Now, in the fall of 2008, it was major household names, like Lehman Brothers, that were on the line. Goldman Sachs was vulnerable and would have gone down. So these major household names that people would have thought were completely solid just a few years earlier now might have gone down. And that's, as you recall, that's when Paulson and all these people came in. The free market Bush administration basically nationalized large portions of the financial sector, doing things that if a South American government official had done that, Fox News would have said that guy's a fascist and we should probably start bombing them, right? But since it was the Bush administration, it was fine. So those sorts of things, in addition to all the cronyism, and let me just tell you one thing, just to while I have this in mind, just so you understand. I know this crowd's pretty well informed, but when I tell sort of normal people, they're shocked to hear this. Remember, the justification for all these extraordinary measures they were doing in the fall of 2008 was that they were saying, oh gosh, we hate to bail out all these big investment bankers. It just gives us pause and so forth. We know it's unfair, but we just want to make sure that lending to Main Street continues, right? We want small businesses to be able to make their payroll. And the irony of that, besides that they're lying, is the way you can be sure they're lying is right at that point when they started doing all those extraordinary measures, the Federal Reserve changed its policy and began paying commercial banks to not make loans to people. All right, now they didn't describe it as such because people might have raised an eyebrow and said, what? The way they described it is they said they paid interest on excess reserves. Okay, so you may have seen charts showing the amount of reserves in the commercial banking system, and it looks like this for 100 years, and then it goes like that. Like, it looks like it's a mistake, and you have to say, no, that's real. That's what the chart looks like. That Bernanke, in about 3 months, pumped in as much money as all previous Fed chairs combined had done since 1913. And since then, it's like he's quadrupled the amount of what's called base money in the system. Okay, so part of what's going on, part of why that hasn't blown up in our faces yet, you don't see $30 gas, there's many reasons, but one reason is the Fed knew if we push all this money in the banking system, we want to kind of keep a lid on it and make sure the banks don't just lend it out into the hands of the general public through the fractional reserve multiplying process that, you know, Bill Still and Edward Griffin can talk about. And so part of how they contained it is they started paying the banks interest. So in other words, they said to the commercial banks, legally, you're allowed to lend this money out. We will pay you if you keep it parked at the Fed. Okay, so that program was instituted in October of 2008, and that was a new policy at the time. So again, the point of that is just to say, right when they were doing all these extraordinary measures, buying mortgage-backed securities, bailing out the big investment banks, they simultaneously started paying the commercial banks to not make loans to people, which was an accurate way of describing what they were doing. So clearly this was not about maintaining the flow of credit to small business or the other sort of justifications they gave. Okay, so if it is true that what Greenspan had done, bringing interest rates down to 1% and hold them for a year, helped fuel the housing bubble, there are other factors, but the Austrians say that was a major contributing factor. Well, what Bernanke did, he brought interest rates down to 0.25%, basically zero, and has held them there for several years, and the Fed tells us they're going to keep them there for a long time. And notice the mentality. They keep saying, well, the Fed's trying. The Fed's doing everything it can, it's just not taking. Right? They're acting like it's medicine when, in fact, it's poison. And notice, too, just the vernacular, the terminology they use. They'll say things like, oh, well, is the Fed out of ammo? And the Fed chief will say, no, we got plenty of ammo to shoot the economy with. Don't worry. Right? So notice just the military metaphors and terminology that, you know, there's the war on drugs, the war on poverty. Well, there's the war on this recession, and the Fed's got ammo. So that, again, it's just the same mentality that's in these other contexts, and we see how it doesn't work. So the Austrians are saying it doesn't work here either. And so one way of thinking about it is, and again, it's sort of depressing. I go around and give these talks, and this is the conclusion, but I'll try to give you some ideas of what we can do. I got about 7 minutes left here. Is that what they have done? Remember, so they replaced the dot-com bubble with the housing bubble. I think that right now what we have is a bubble in government debt. That, in other words, the interest rates, the yields on all these government securities, not just the United States but European governments as well, is ridiculously low compared to how much debt they've piled on and how vulnerable they are. That just if interest rates rise just a little bit, they're sunk, right? That the interest payments they would have to make would consume a huge portion of their total tax receipts, and so they're incredibly it's like a knife edge result at this point, where if a little thing gets tweaked and it goes wrong, they're in trouble. Let me give you another example of this, because again, it's an older crowd here, and some of you might understand this terminology more than like undergrads would. But you guys know what the yield curve is, or a lot of you do. It's like the interest rates at various maturities, so like short-term bonds, longer term, out to 30-year, and so it's what's called the yield curve, and the yields go up. Someone recently did an analysis of the Fed's balance sheet, and they said if the yield curve just shifted up 37 basis points, that's 0.37%, the Federal Reserve would be insolvent. Okay, now I know some of you don't know what that means. Other users are like, holy crap. But what that means is that, you know, if you buy a bond and then interest rates go up, the value of your bond goes down. Okay, the market price. So what we're saying is the way the Fed has gobbled up so many bonds lately in the last several years, that if interest rates ticked up just 0.37 percentage points, then the Fed would be bankrupt. Now, it's not that they would shut down. They would just say, well, who cares? We can print money. You know, it's good if you can get it. But the point is, I'm just trying to show you how reckless what they have been doing is in terms of any standard conventional accounting or business sense. All right, so that's the precarious nature. And so, unfortunately, I think what it meant is, before we had .com crash, but there were no major household names in trouble in the early 2000s. They gave us the housing bubble, that blew up. Now in 2008, they told us we have to act because major household investment banks are on the line. The next crisis that comes, I think it's going to be governments will be on the line. It might not be the U.S. government, probably won't be. It would probably be other ones like European governments, where there's, the investors will have a run on their treasuries and dump their bonds, like what happened in Greece, but bigger countries like Spain and Portugal and so forth. All right, and so that ironically might give strength to the U.S. dollar for a bit while people flee the euro and come to the dollar. But the point is, it's the same. We're doing the same stuff they are, and so if a crisis hits Europe, it's eventually going to come here. And when it does, people will be scratching their heads and saying, "How do we stop this contagion? What's going on?" When it's because of these policies we've been doing. So, last few minutes here, what sort of things can we do besides just go get hammered tonight? And we should do that. But my Roy Orbison's really good if you're drunk. What we should do is just a few things. So as Josh says, obviously, it's for me, I mean, yes, it is becoming self-employed, but the way I phrase it to people is say get multiple streams of income. That you don't want to be dependent on just one thing and say that's my job in particular, but even if it's just a business you have, that because if and when this crash comes, everything's going to get upturned, and that particular source of income you have might dry up. So you want to have several things going so that depending on what happens, you can kind of adjust your weight and favor something else, and you don't want to be starting that from scratch. So if you've been toying with the idea of starting a business for the last 5 years and it's just, I'll do it after Dancing with the Stars, what season ends, do that sooner rather than later. You don't want to be trying to start your new business when there's an extra 20 million unemployed people all trying to do the same thing, right? You want to get your idea up and running first. Another major thing is if I'm right about what's coming, interest rates are going to skyrocket. And so if you have variable rate interest rate debt, you don't want to be sitting on that. So in particular, credit cards, but also if you have like an adjustable mortgage, you might want to seriously consider switching that over to a fixed rate, because again, as things reset, as interest rates rise, you could get pinched. And then of course the obvious thing, and I don't feel funny giving these recommendations because this would be sensible stuff in any environment, but you need to save more. And as I said, I don't just mean, okay, instead of going to Starbucks, why don't you go to McDonald's and get their coffee because it's a little bit cheaper. No, what I mean is you start bringing in way more income and then saving it. And I think that's, this is kind of dovetailing with what Josh is. For me, I think the fundamental problem that people have, especially younger people, is they just assume, I got to do my budget and what's my income, and they just take that number as a fixed thing and then plan around that. And that's good. Yeah, obviously you don't want to spend more than you take in. You want to save a bunch, but a really easy way to save more is not to scrimp and pinch corners here and kill yourself in terms of an austerity budget, but rather to boost your income. And there's all kinds of stuff you can do. And people will say, okay, well, Bobby, I liked your talk or whatever. You said start a business, so what should I do? And that's a crazy question, because if I had some answer that I gave to everyone, then they'd all be doing that one thing, and that would no longer be a good thing to do, right? So the answer is you go look and figure out what people want that you can do, and then do that. In particular, if you really like doing it, then all the better. And so, that sounds like a truism, okay, yeah, but really, just open your eyes and look around and start looking for opportunities as to what would people want. And it could even be in your own life, like something that frustrates you on a daily basis, and say, yeah, there ought to be somebody doing such and such. Well, maybe you could be that person, or you could find people who are talented and you could get together a business plan and start providing that service or that product. So the takeaway message, the one thing I really want to make sure, my last minute here, is what I don't want to have happen is that, let's say the Austrians are right and things are chugging along, the way it would play out is that the banks would start lending that money out, prices would start rising, the government's interest payments would start rising, they would have to cut their spending because now, our interest payments are resetting, they'd have to start cutting spending a little bit, the Fed would have to start raising interest rates, then there would be a crash, and the Keynesians would all say, see, we told you not to raise interest rates, you idiots, we told you not to cut government spending, it caused another depression. When it would have been, no, it's what the Austrians were saying, that these policies we've been doing, this easy money, big, huge deficit spending as if there's no tomorrow, That's what set up this unsustainable period that led to a crash. So that's why I want to make sure people get educated beforehand, so that when it does happen, we can at least understand what caused it and not let the media and the government explain, well, what happened here was you guys just had too much freedom and you didn't give us enough money and power. If you just give us a little bit more, we promise this won't happen again. Okay, everyone. Thanks.